Nice to meet you all. Well, I'm very, very excited to be here tonight because I'm getting an opportunity to meet, albeit at some distance, one of my favourite authors. So Mary Roach, if you don't know already, she's a huge bestseller, fantastic science writer, and she writes exactly the kind of books that I like to read. So they're fascinating and funny in equal measure. And she's been described as America's funniest science writer, and her latest, Animal, Vegetable, Criminal, certainly fits the bill. Here it is. It's absolutely brilliant. And you've got to, just to kick off, I know this is unconventional because Mary should do the reading really, but I just can't resist with opening this event with the first line from Mary's book, which is, on June 26, 1659, a representative from 5 towns in a province of northern Italy initiated legal proceedings against caterpillars, which is just an absolutely brilliant opening line and gives you a hint at just how marvellous the book is going to be. So Mary, what on earth are the caterpillars standing trial for, and what is this book about?
The caterpillars had been doing the things that caterpillars do, which is they've been eating the crops. They've been making pests of themselves in the area, and so the village fathers, as it were, decided to post these signs saying the caterpillars that were to appear in court on a set date, at which point they would be assigned legal representation. Obviously, the caterpillars did not appear in court, but this was written up in this book, this 1906 book called the Criminal Prosecution and Capital Punishment of Animals, which sort of got me headed down this path, because I remember thinking this book has to be a hoax, like they couldn't possibly have done these things. But when you think about it, the caterpillar trial, the trial went forward without the caterpillars. And in fact, what happened is that there was a decision made that, well, we'll set aside some land for these caterpillars, and the people shall have their land, and the caterpillars shall have their land, and everyone will be happy. But at that point, the caterpillars had pupated, had left. And so it appeared to be a workable solution, and everyone was happy. But that said, it does seem, and it did seem to me, that legal proceedings are not the way to handle human-wildlife conflicts, and that it's probably better to look to science. And that is what the book is about.
I mean, I was aware of these medieval animal trials before, and I mean, just the surreal glory. You must have almost trembled with excitement when you found that book, that with everything so detailed in it, because I mean, they're just so gloriously bizarre, but also so bizarrely fair, really. I mean, that seems like a very fair solution to the issue. Would you say that, with the sort of modern solutions as fair, in fact? Do you think we've evolved in our way of dealing with animals? We've come a ways from where we were in the United States, anywhere where we were in the 1800s and early 1900s. But I have to say, looking back on that time, there were some very fair approaches. I mean, the one that I just mentioned, and also there was someone who said, I think they were talking about mice or voles or some kind of rodent, and they made special dispensation for the mother with young offspring, that you weren't to destroy them. I mean, it was very, I think, for the people who are coming up with these decrees and these regulations, I think they impressed the populace as being wise and fair and good, which mattered back then, obviously not in politics today, in my country anyway. So, but back then, I think it was an interesting kind of a mix of pest control and public relations. And I mean, when you're looking at there's a huge amount, as we know now. I mean, the population expanding, however many billion people we've currently got on the planet, and with animals being conserved these days, this rub between humans and animals is becoming increasingly prevalent all across the world. And I think that's what's really fantastic as well about the book, is that you don't, there is a snapshot of all sorts of different human animal conflict across the world. And I just, how did you start choosing? I mean, were there some like, I've got to do that story? Or, I mean, how did you, because there are so many that you can choose. So what was your sort of whittling down process, and how did you start?
Yeah, for me, it is always about how can I put myself into a scene? How can I be there while something's happening? So I was looking for ways to not just sort of write about, here's a conflict, here's what could be done, here's the situation, but to actually throw myself into it. So in poking around, I came across the Wildlife Institute of India, and this individual, Dipanjan Naha, who is going to be going out on the road doing some work with human leopard conflict and also human elephant conflict. And India fascinated me, first of all, because I could go with him. He agreed to let me tag along. The fool. He said yes. I love when people say yes. They have no idea what a pain I am. But he said yes, and India turned out to be really interesting. In particular, I also covered monkey-human conflict in the cities, and with both the monkeys and the elephants, the fact that they are, in the Hindu religion, they're represented as gods. So there's this built-in respect and this hesitation to do anything to these animals that's harmful, and it's an interesting balance of people wanting to protect them and not wanting people to harm them, but on the other hand, wanting the government to just make them stop being a pain, fix it, but don't hurt them. So it really is that was a fascinating place, and that was a definite. I stumbled onto some issues that the Vatican is having with gulls, and I thought, well, I don't know how many chances do you have to do your research in Vatican City? So that appealed to me. And then New Zealand, because it's an island nation that is dealing with some extremes of invasive species wiping out their own biodiversity, particularly with flightless birds, and they have a unique approach, and so that seemed like an obvious one to include. Also, New Zealand, it's beautiful. So I have to admit, there's a little bit of like, I would love to go there. But for the most part, it's what will make an interesting scene where I can actually be present, reporting as it unfolds. So that is a huge part of for me. In the United States, of course, it's easy to find ways into the bear situation. Aspen, Colorado has quite an issue because the bears are there in the mountains, and people have moved in because this is where we ski. So they've moved into this bear country where the bears have naturally, there's all kinds of good food sources, and then the humans come in and provide these other easy food sources in the form of trash and garbage and sunflower seeds for the birds and dog food left on the porch. So there's massive bear human problems there. So that was an obvious one. And here in the United States, in California, cougars, mountain lions, that is, the interchangeable name. That's a fascinating dilemma as well. So they were chosen by what kind of scene can I build out of it? Because of course there's hundreds of countries and hundreds of species with different conflicts, and each conflict has its own approach, its own solution, its own challenges, and I couldn't possibly cover them all. But it is a fascinating topic. I kind of wish I may have to do a volume 2.
Well, I mean, I hope you do, because I mean, I really, really did love this, and I'm going to pull apart some of the species that you've just referred to, and some of the stories. We'll go back to those in more detail, but let's start on sort of your home turf. Let's start in America with the bears, because I was hiking in California once, and I was actually the end of a relationship was actually precipitated by this particular hiking incident, because we fared so badly. We basically, the boyfriend at the time said we didn't need a map, and I said, but I think we do need a map, and he's like, no, we don't need a map. Anyway, we ended up getting incredibly lost, and just as it was getting dark, we started to see bears everywhere. Just like, and cubs, and no sign of the mothers as well. So just like, really terrified, and ended up being rescued by a pair of octogenarian retired professors with Zimmer frames who were the last people left in the park. And I ran towards them screaming, going, help, help. This is I was trying to mug them or something. So the whole thing was like, but anyway, my question to you is, they were black bears. So how much danger was I in, and what should I have done?
You were in very little danger. Yeah, you were in very little danger. Where were you in the Yosemite?
Yeah, just behind the bit that's behind. Yeah.
Yeah, Yosemite. Yeah, the number of I think we have between 0 and 3 people killed per year in North America, or is it in the US? Anyway, it's a very small number. Bears, because if you had been hiking with a dog instead of a boyfriend, possibly interchangeable in this case, I don't know.
The dogs last longer in my life, actually.
Yeah, right. If you'd been, when people get into trouble, it's usually because they're in a tent, they've left food in the tent. Like there's something tempting for the bear. The bear wants it. So somebody may have something that smells fragrant, and they're in their tent, and the bear wants to get at it. The person wakes up, startles the bear, and there's that kind of split second where the bear decides, you know what, you're done for. I want this food. Or someone has a dog, and the dog gets into it with the bear. The person tries to intervene, and the bear, it's called attack redirection, or the bear redirects the attack from the dog to the person. That sometimes happens. You didn't have a dog, you weren't in the tent. Typically, if you just sort of shout and wave your arms, the bears just run off. There's no reason for them to attack. I mean, the fact that they were young there, people talk about that a lot as being a very dangerous scenario, but the folks up in Canada, where I spent time researching the attack chapters, said that that's actually very rare that somebody's been killed because there's been babies in a sow, that it's not as dangerous as people think. The thing to do is to just make yourself look big and scary and make noise and just let the animal know. The worst thing you can do with any kind of, particularly with cougars, but bears as well, to run away quickly. You don't want to do that. Just kind of like talk and back away slowly, and you'll be fine. The bears are they're particularly in places like Yosemite and Aspen. They see people. They're almost like big raccoons. They're after the food. People get annoyed. They run off. The sad part of it is that often these bears do end up getting destroyed because they get used to people and people's food, and they lose their fear of people, and they're perceived as a public safety threat and destroyed. So the bears are in a lot more danger than the people in almost every case, sadly. I mean, not sadly, not to say I want the people to be in danger, but it's a sad situation for the bears that get very accustomed to humans and their food.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that I want to unpick so much of that. But firstly, I just want to say is that you just showed me a different side to bears, because they were sort of, the bear criminals are surprisingly gentle and smart. And there was a bit about how they unwrapped the foil on a Hershey's Kiss. And tell me a little bit, were you surprised by the dexterity and the gentleness and the smarts of the bears?
I was. I spent an afternoon driving around with a man named Curtis Desch, who works for Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and we went out on a call. There'd been a break-in. So we went to the scene of the crime. And as we were driving there, I asked him to tell me some stories that stood out in his mind. And I imagined he'd be talking about, like murder and mayhem and gore. And the stories that he told, though, were about, like you said, they were about bears breaking in, opening the fridge, reaching in, pulling out a container of eggs, setting it aside, not breaking any, or the fact that they prefer the premium ice cream brands to the crappy ice cream brand. The Hershey's Kiss story was amazing. And one story was about how, the bear, there's a door, and the bear was confronted with this door, pulled the door off its hinges, didn't toss it aside and mangle it, but leaned it carefully against the side of the house. And there's some bears that will break in. I mean, not all of them. Certainly, they make a mess in a lot of kitchens, but some of them will, like this. In this case, the bear broke in on a lower level and went through the bedroom, which had white carpeting, and there was no marks on the floor. Went up the stairs, through the house, didn't knock anything over. Just went to the fridge, took out the honey, the ice cream, etc., and ate these things and left. And so didn't actually create a mess at all. And it was quite impressive. It was not because I don't live in bear country. I'm in a city, so I'm not exposed to them that often, and I have that stereotypical view of them as these, big scary things that you want to avoid and that you that are threatening. And it couldn't have been more further from the truth. I mean, I ended up I went into a back alley where all the restaurants are in Aspen at 3 a.m, dragged the researcher, like, look, can we get up at 3 a.m. and go into the back alleys? Because I wanted to kind of witness a crime in action, and turned out to be very easy to do that. But we were standing there, and these two, we parked his truck, because we saw a big garbage bag that had been ripped open. It's garbage spilling out. Like we had just missed that. So he said, we'll just park. They'll be back. And within a minute, there they come lumbering down the alley. And I didn't feel fear. It was, we were about 20 feet away from these bears. They just looked at us, looked at the food, thought, okay, there's some humans. We're going to go back to our food scraps. And it was quite a fancy restaurant that they'd chosen. So there was some good eating. There was crab legs and burrata and sustainable Skuna-based salmon. It was all kinds of good stuff in there. So we just stood and watched them. And I felt just awe and excitement, not fear. So it was an enlightening trip. I mean, I have very different feelings about bears now than when I started the project.
Yeah, I bet you do. I thought it was really fascinating that you said that garbage is a killer, and that's really, in this sort of scenario, it's the trash that's the enemy, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the trash, and it's the people who can't be bothered to secure the trash. There are laws in place, and it's very easy to say, oh, well, we can solve this by just passing legislation that everybody has to secure their trash. But the reality is completely different. First of all, sometimes people don't bother. And Aspen, Colorado is a resort vacation area. So a lot of these homes are vacation rentals. People come in from out of town. They're not from bear country. They don't know what they're supposed to do. They don't know the consequences of getting bears accustomed to eating human food. So they don't bother. And then there's one dumpster for a whole condo full of people. So if there is a violation of the regulation, who do you give the fine to? Everybody can say, oh, it wasn't me that left it open. So, and that happens with downtown, where all these restaurants are sharing one large dumpster. There's no way to prove that this particular employee of this restaurant was the one who left it open. So nobody gets fined. And half the containers were broken. And, you go down the alley there'd be one of those big grease containers, which people empty the fryer grease into this. So it's a sort of a size of a drinking fountain. And the bears would literally use it like a drinking fountain, because the bears, before they go into hibernation, they're looking for a concentrated source of calories. And what could be better than a giant box of oil, cooking oil? And so the researcher described that sometimes you'd see bear prints in grease leading away from these containers. So it's quite a challenge. You really need to have people who are on it full time, trying to educate people, trying to make it clear that you will be fined, and also just explaining to people why it is that they're being fined, what the consequences are, because some people don't understand why they have to do it, and how many bears are getting killed every year.
Destroyed. I found that incredibly moving, actually. That Curtis Tesh, that story that of how he was faced with having to execute a mother and her baby, you know, tell me about, I mean.
Yeah, it was, you know, he's a man of few words. He was just sort of, you know, yeah, you could come along. And at one point driving back from this house, we were talking, and I said, it can't be fun to have to put down a bear. And he said, no, it's not fun at all. And he said, just a few days ago, he said there was a mother and her cub who had been regularly breaking in. There's a lot of recidivism with bears. A lot of the break-ins in an area will be one bear and her cub or cubs, and that was the case here with a mother and a cub. And he said, I had to really think on, I didn't want the mother to see the baby destroyed. I didn't want the baby to see the mother destroyed. So I tranquilized one and then killed the other. And it was just, you know, you could tell it was just, and a lot of these folks who work for places like Parks and Wildlife or Fish and Wildlife, they're people that got involved in this work because they studied wildlife biology and they love animals and the outdoors. And they're the ones having to do this very difficult thing. And they also get a lot of blowback. They get death threats. They get, you know, people get very upset when bears are destroyed, and they take the brunt of it when it's not their fault. It's the fault of the people who've left trash out, who haven't, you know, followed regulations. And that was a kind of an emotional moment. Yeah.
Yeah, I found it very moving, actually. I really enjoyed meeting so many of the characters in the book, and sort of understanding this, you know, a very surreal job, but also the struggle behind that. You know, this is sort of, you know, trying to manage these extraordinary situations. And of course, you know, not all problem bears are killed, but many are translocated now. And tell me, does that actually work? Does it work?
It sometimes works, but more often than not, what happens when you have a bear that's used to getting its food from human sources, you take that bear and you translocate it. You put it in another forest. Very often, and I can't remember the exact statistic, but there are studies. Very often that bear makes its way to the closest human community. That bear, and if there's cubs, the cubs, makes its way to that community and begins to do the same thing. So you're kind of just moving the problem elsewhere. And the other factor in that is that if this bear then gets into situations where a human is hurt or killed, now the agency that translocated the bear is possibly going to be sued. That's happened where, you know, you put this bear here, the bear's killed somebody, you know, we're going to sue you. So liability factors into this. That's also a factor with making the decision. You know, when a bear has started getting involved in a human habitation where they're taking garbage, maybe they're breaking in, you could make the argument, well, nothing, maybe we'll just watch the situation for a while and just not destroy the bear. Let's just see how it goes. If there's a scenario where the bear could, you know, breaks in, say there's a dog in the house, people get involved, somebody gets hurt, somebody gets mauled. Now the agency that said, we know about this, but we're going to watch the situation. Now they're liable because they didn't do anything. And there was $1 million, $4 million, I think it was, payout for just such a scenario. I think it was in Arizona, also Utah. I think there was a case where the agency, you know, trying to, you know, it's a difficult decision. At what point do we, the agency, move in to trap and destroy this animal? You know, in Colorado, they typically, when there's been break-ins, when, you know, nobody's been harmed, but it's a dangerous situation, and so a trap will be put out. If the person calls it in, a lot of people will not call in a bear break-in because they know the consequence will be that Parks and Wildlife will set a culvert trap, and if they catch the animal, well, they might try, you know, putting it back in the forest. They might try translocation, especially if there's been a media attention paid to the case. but often it's destroyed. So people know that, and they don't call it in. So it's hard to know what the best thing to do is and when to do it.
And in, there's all sorts of aggravating factors as well. One of which I just completely surprised me was in India, the issue of alcohol, how it exacerbates human-animal conflict, not just the humans, but also the animals as well. So tell me about that, because that was amazing.
Yeah. Well, the human side of it, what happens in India, I should just sort of set up the scenario.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's my job. That's okay. India, and this completely flabbergasted me. 500 people a year. I mean, India is a very populous nation, so that's part of it. But 500 people a year are killed by wild elephants, and that is because what happens? Elephants tend to move. There's a sort of, they call it the elephant corridor across the northern part of India, where they're just moving along. They're looking for food. They're just doing the thing that they've always done. Meanwhile, there's a lot more human habitation. There's military bases. There's highways being built. So they often get kind of stuck in a pocket of forest where there's not really enough for them to eat. They move in big groups, and so they come through a village. A lot of these villages in northern India, people grow their own crops. So they are subsistence farms. So the elephants come through, and you can imagine you have 10 elephants coming through a plot of crops, and they, even if they don't eat anything, just walking through, they destroy a lot of the vegetables. And so people get upset, understandably, because this is their livelihood. So, and often the elephants are doing this in the evening, and people have been drinking often, and I think 36% of people killed by elephants were inebriated at the time, because the scenario is, it's dark. Somebody yells that elephants are coming. As you know, you drink a bit, you have a little more courage than you normally would, and they run out and they have torches and they have firecrackers. And the thing with elephants, they're a social animal. They feel safer in a herd. So if you break apart a social grouping, the animals panic, they get more aggressive. You have people running around in the dark, drunk, falling over. People get stepped on, they get trampled. It's just not a safe scenario. For that reason, some of these villages, the Wildlife Institute of India has been encouraging communities to set up elephant response teams who go out in a vehicle, which is safer, and try to keep the herd together and kind of herd them back toward the forest. But yes, you mentioned the elephants as well like to drink, and that is true. They they like, a lot of in these villages, sometimes people, there's this home brew called Haria with 2 A's. I may be mispronouncing it, but people make batches of that, and the elephants can smell it because it's quite fragrant, and elephants do like to tipple. They like to drink. Often they just kind of get sleepy and kind of wander off and aren't a problem. Some of them, they'll get aggressive. There's always an aggressive drunk in every group, humans or elephants. So the elephants, people sometimes bring the alcohol inside the home, thinking that will keep the elephants away from it. But this is an elephant, and these homes are not sturdily built. So the elephant just basically sees no reason not to just pull down the wall and get at that alcohol. And that's a dangerous scenario. It's literally the elephant in the room. And there have been cases where, I mean, sometimes it's just property damage, but other times people have been hurt or killed. Yeah.
The menace of drunk elephants. And I didn't realize this. It's actually incredibly easy to get an elephant drunk, isn't it? Because it is. Yes. Yeah. It's somebody. What I love is that someone did research on this, and somebody figured out. I have it. It's in the book, the exact amount of alcohol it takes to get an elephant drunk, and it's not that much. Someone speculated that they lack the enzyme that breaks the alcohol down, and that basically elephants are an easy drunk. Someone actually described what they tend to do when they get drunk. They wander off, and they
they sort of stand kind of, and they weave back and forth and wrap their trunk around themselves and then sort of lie down and sleep it off. Yeah.
I mean, I found there were quite a lot of parallels with humans. Did you feel like, I mean, when you talk about drunk elephants, there's always an aggressive one, and that their behaviour, and also with the translocating and the sort of social problems, and
Yes.
it made the animals seem more human in many ways. The problems that we have, cross species, basically, in many ways. Did you find that? Did you feel that?
Yeah, I did. It was quite a struggle not to anthropomorphize, not to kind of fall into that when I was working on the book, because yes, it's, you look at these animals and you can't help but feel this kind of kinship when you see these behaviors, and just like picturing a bear kind of opening a Hershey's Kiss, or like going for the Haagen-Dazs or the craft beer instead of the cheap shit. It was kind of and I think as humans, we have a propensity to do that. We just like to kind of see that in other species. But yeah, it was very tempting to do that, and especially with the monkeys in particular, and even like gulls. I had a chapter that had to do with gulls, and they have some rather, I think the word I used was dickish behavior, and I was trying to get at, there's got to be an evolutionary reason for this. There must be an explanation. And there was this case where these gulls, and this is the Vatican chapter for the Easter Mass, right before Easter Mass, which is said outside in St. Peter's Square. There's a massive floral display that is set up around the altar and on the steps coming up to the altar. Huge, thousands of flowers that trucked down from the Netherlands. And a couple of years back, right before they were going to let the crowds in, and around 4 or 5 in the morning, this group of gulls just came down and just like ripped these daffodils out of their pots and threw the roses everywhere. Didn't eat anything. Gulls eat almost anything, but not flowers. Nothing was eaten, just thrown around. And the poor florists, who had a team of like 4 people who had spent the day setting this up, were like trying to madly clean it up. And I talked to some gull researchers, like, what why are they just jerks? What was going on there? Just vandalism. But anyway,
no respect for religion whatsoever.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I live in a seaside town, and so I'm very familiar with gulls. I'm very early on from moving here. I had a sandwich stolen clean out of my hand.
Yes.
And then I actually I made a whole documentary for the BBC about that. And I had to go and spend a summer in Cornwall where investigating it. And it turned out it was sort of, because they all get tarred with the same brush. Like everybody thinks all gulls are.
Yes.
But it's a cultural thing.
Yes.
It's actually there's dickish culture in certain gull families that are like the bad pennies that are giving everybody else the bad reputation.
Yeah, there was this study done on there's a Appledore Island here in the U.S. where there's it's a nesting and breeding site, and they looked at cannibalism in gulls eating babies, usually someone else's, but sometimes their own. And they looked at it's right there. Yes, I'm hungry. So they looked at who was doing the cannibalizing, and because it was like hundreds of chicks were eaten, and it turned out to be just like 4 or 5 really nasty individuals. And it didn't have to do with how much food there was. It was just, we kind of like the taste of baby gull. This is what we like to eat, and we're going to do it. But it was fascinating. Yeah. And that happened with all of this conflict. There's, because people with bears, there's some arguments like, oh, we just need to hunt more of them. And it's certain individuals that are doing it over and over and over. In Yosemite, they looked at car break-ins. Bears like to break into some bears break into cars, often minivans, because it doesn't matter why, but they break into cars. And a study that was done showed that of 1,100 car break-ins by bears, I think it was 5 individual bears that had done all of it. So it's not a matter of, reducing the population. It's a matter of, figuring out which bears it is, maybe trying to translocate them somewhere far away from minivans.
Good luck with that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Good luck with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, yes. Yeah. It says, some gulls like to fish. Some gulls go for stuff on the ground, garbage. Other gulls eat other gulls. Some of them eat, grab other birds. So yeah, it's interesting because they're to us, they all kind of look alike. We assume that they act alike, but they have the individual differences. That was something else from this book. Not just gulls, but almost all of these species, such a wide variation in individual, almost personalities, you would say, and behaviors. Yeah.
Absolutely. I totally, that's what my research has shown, similar things. So it's fascinating, this idea, animals really do have culture, and it's,
yes,
particularly in the way that they hunt and eat.
Yeah.
And what's sort of interesting as well is with these different, these sort of triggers that bring into the conflict, so with the gulls, you've got some that have got a culture and they've learned how to steal a sandwich or whatever, but yeah. When the sort of the greatest threat that everybody worries about is man killers, these beasts that are gonna, but what was interesting to me that came, I didn't realize from your book, was so fascinating, that that's a human trigger as well. In the case of the leopards, what triggers a man killer? Tell us about that.
Yeah,
it was fascinating.
That was so interesting. The difference. Yeah, I traveled with that individual Dipanja Naha from the Wildlife Institute of India, and we were up in the north of India, the middle Himalaya, not the big, snow-capped peaks, but the middle Himalaya. There are a lot of leopards up there. There are also leopards in the lower elevations of India, but they're not man-eaters. They are, and that term man-eater, I don't like it, but we use it just because that's what people say. Yeah. So in the lower elevations, people say if they're working in a tea estate, they might stumble onto a leopard that's napping in the shade under the plants. The leopard is startled. They're startled. There's a scuffle, and the leopard runs off. But in the middle Himalaya, there's this situation where the leopards there will stalk and hunt humans for food as prey, and that's not always been the case, and it's not typical. And often it's, of course, the easier targets, sadly, which is children. 41% of the time, it's children under 10 that the animals prey on. And I was interested in what makes a man-eater, person-eater. They're more often actually female leopards that have cubs to feed. So man-eater is kind of a misnomer anyway. But it was interesting. There was a theory put out by Jim Corbett, who was one of the hunters that would come in when there was a legendary man killer. And his theory was, in the Great Flu Pandemic, 1918, that was a period of time where there were so many people dying so quickly, the bodies weren't managed in the same way. Wasn't time to take them all down to the Ganges, and so they just kind of would roll them down the hill in the general direction of the river. And so leopards developed a taste for human flesh. That was his theory. The researcher that I traveled with said that, in fact, what makes more sense today is that there's been a lot of outmigration from the small villages to the cities. A lot of the men have left to find jobs. So women and children are tending to the cattle and the livestock, or just leaving them untended. So, untended livestock is an easy dinner for leopards. So leopards are more encouraged to get their food from the inhabited areas. And also when there's, say there's a 11 or 12-year-old child tending the flock or the herd, though that's also unfortunately kind of easy pickings. And because a lot of the farmland has now overgrown, there's more cover. I mean, leopards like to have cover when they hunt so they can get closer. because the brush hasn't been cleared. So that contributes as well. So it was all tied in with what's going on with the human population. Not so much that there was a killer personality. It was these were crimes of opportunity. Yeah.
Absolutely. And one of the other things that was in India that I just thought was also just like a brilliant, extraordinary story was you mentioned it earlier at the very start, was the monkeys. It's just the idea that that animals are being used to control other animals. So tell us about the langurs, because this is just this is a gift.
Yeah,
story, really.
Yeah, the langurs. Yeah. The langurs are a bigger monkey. They're bigger, and the rhesus monkeys, who are the nuisance animal, that rhesus monkeys get into a lot of mischief in urban areas, well, rural as well, but in the cities they move around in groups, and they steal things from people, and they knock over flower pots, and they come into the apartment and wreak havoc, and so they're people don't like to have them around. And for a while, what was being done was there were men with langurs on leashes who would patrol, and the langurs would scare away the rhesus monkeys. At a certain point, that was forbidden because it goes against the Wildlife Protection Act, and it was thought to be not fair to keep the langurs in captivity. So that was made illegal. And then the next solution that they tried was to hire and train people to impersonate the calls of langurs. One news account said that they had dressed up in langur suits, which is not true. They did not, which sadly, because that would have been wonderful to see. But they would train them in the call, how to impersonate the calls of the langurs. And somebody else, for a while, there was someone who had tried just going around with a langur and having it urinate on the property, that the smell of the langur urine would keep away the rhesus monkeys. There was a quote by, I think it was in the New York Times, there was an interview with one of these langur guys, and he said, "Yes, I have 65 langurs urinating on prominent homes."
Yeah, I love that. But I also love that when Donald and Melania Trump visited the Taj Mahal in 2020, the security detail included paramilitary forces, armed constabulary units, National Security Guard commandos, and 5 langurs. So good. Yeah. But so the langurs. So that's that. I mean it is. It's a sort of. It's a miracle of human invention, really. The amount of kind of ways that we have devised to try and deal with different species, and I mean, there's such a sort of glorious array. And what was one of your? I mean, and some of them are so fantastically surreal. I mean, frankly, more surreal than caterpillars being on trial in many cases. I think.
I think
Did you have you could just tell me one of your favorites or two of your favorites?
Yeah. The one that I really loved was the effigies, the vulture effigies. This is something that this was kind of discovered by accident. But if you have a dead vulture and you hang it by the feet with the wings kind of flopped out, and you let it sort of spin and dangle, no other vultures will come anywhere near. And it's very effective. It's something like 8 months, which is so much more effective than, say those those little sculptures, statues of owls that are supposed to keep pigeons away, right? That kind of thing lasts, the effectiveness is about 8 hours. They're just not very effective. But to hang an effigy is actually the wildlife services people, that is the term, that is the formal term. It's an effigy. And sometimes they're made with styrofoam, but the wings are real. It's thought that you have to have some feathers. And the thing that's fascinating is that no one really understands why it works. And people often say, oh, because the vultures look at it and go, I don't want to end up like that, which is, ascribing probably more cognitive powers than vultures have, but nobody really knows. It's just that it works. It looks strange, and perhaps they recognize it's one of their own. Who knows what's going through the mind of these vultures, but it does work well. The problem, and they do it, they use effigies down in the Everglades in Florida. Vultures, I love vultures. They're so bizarre.
Yeah.
Vultures do this thing, not just vultures, some other species as well, but vultures will come into the parking lots where people, who are visiting the Everglades park before they go out fishing or kayaking. And the vultures come in and they pull the rubber off the windshield wipers, or the seals around the sunroof. They come in and they just rip it off. So the Everglades, the park people started hanging effigies around the parking lot, which worked really well, except that the staff at the visitor center had to calm down freaked out people going, somebody's hung dead birds all around the parking lot. What's going on? And they're like, oh, well, these are effigies. It's a very effective deterrent. Anyway, so they stopped hanging they got tired of explaining the dead birds. So now, if you go there, there's a box of tarps and a sign that says, please put a tarp over your car or the vultures will tear up your windshield wipers.
Yeah, I mean, that's just I mean, some of these stories you must have, because it's deliciously funny, I mean, there's so many sort of wonderfully surreal stories in there, and many of them just the footnotes, by the way, I was really enjoying. There's some fantastic little stories in the footnotes, and another one of those very, very surreal ones, which was in Guam, how they dealt with the invasive. Do you want to tell us about that? Because it's so great.
Oh, yeah. In Guam, they have a problem with brown tree snakes. Okay, so the US government, actually the military, because Guam is essentially a big military base. And the idea was, well, we can poison these snakes, and what works pretty well is Tylenol. It just it's kind of a humane, quick way to kill brown tree snakes. And they're like, okay, great, Tylenol. Now, how do we get it into the brown tree snakes and keep it away from other species? That's always the issue with when you just make the decision to try to poison some invasive species. How do you not poison and kill other creatures? If you put it in a tasty bait, you run the risk of poisoning non-target species. So what they came up with, the military, that is, they put the bait into this kind of neonatal mice, little dead mice, which is something, if you have snakes, that they like that. So they tried that. They came up with a bait. That was the whole situation on its own. But they finally came up with something that the brown tree snakes would reliably eat. And then to get it there, they flew overhead and they dropped the bait in little parachutes. Each little bait had a little parachute that it would drop down and had streamers, so it would entangle in the branches. So it would be hanging in the branches of the trees. So they didn't want it down on the ground where other animals could get it. So but it turned out it was way too labor intensive to kind of tie the little parachute strings to the bait thousands of times. So now they have helicopters going. There's a machine gun that shoots baited dead mouse pellets that come down and get caught in the branches. So there's just a lot of creativity going into the brown tree snake problem. But I loved the little parachutes. It's kind of like a children's toy with a little plastic soldier, and a picture of that floating down with a dead mouse attached to it.
Yeah, just amazing, just absolutely fantastic. But it's not just animals that are problems in the book as well. I've got to ask you, how can a tree be murderous?
Yeah, I have a chapter on danger trees, which is a technical term, danger tree. And it's in there partly because the title of the book, Animal, Vegetable, Criminal, which is a play on a game in the US, the Kids Play Animal, Vegetable, Mineral, which you guys don't have. So the whole title of my book probably makes no sense there.
We have it.
You do have Animal,
Yeah,
Vegetable,
we know.
Mineral? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Anyway, so my editor, she's like, Mary, you have to have some vegetable matter in this book, because to my mind, it was like, animal, vegetable, it's nature. People get it. She doesn't, no, you need vegetable matter. So I looked around and I found danger trees. The danger tree, this is often a very old, very tall, decrepit tree that is getting ready to fall over in the next storm. And there's certain parks in the US where people specifically come to see these hundreds of years old conifers, these Douglas firs, in this case, up in, this was in Vancouver, outside Vancouver. And these trees, people are coming to see these beautiful trees. So you don't want to cut them down as they start to get very, very old and in danger of falling over. But there was a situation some years back where during a storm, a family had pulled over, ironically, to be safe during this storm. And one of these trees fell over onto the car and everyone was killed. So since then, the park has hired had a danger tree assessor on staff. So I went out with the danger tree assessor, who's been following some of these ancient elderly trees for 15 years, saying, yeah, okay, I think we got it. This one's starting to rot inside, but they rot very slowly. I think we're good for another year. And then when they do make the decision, all right, it's time to take this tree down or to make it, shorter so it's safer. They bring in I love the job titles that I came across for this book. This guy is a danger tree faller blaster. Danger tree faller blaster. Faller meaning they fall trees. We call them lumberjacks, or there's another term, but anyway, they're called fallers there. So this guy climbs up this, 2/3 of the way up this massive Douglas fir, drills a couple holes in the side, puts dynamite in, comes back down, goes a safe distance away, blows off the top. And the reason they do that is because if you're a tourist driving through, you have no idea that the top of this tree is gone. So the forest looks basically the same. It still looks beautiful with these big, giant, mossy trees, but the top is off, so it's more stable. It's less dangerous. It's dying anyway. It's on the way out. So, this way, there's still the tree can become habitat for different animals. Bears like to go in when the tree starts to rot and hollow out. There's certain birds that sort of build cavities. And so the trees still serve a function in the forest and they still look beautiful, but they're not dangerous. So that's a whole, deciding when to do that, how to do that was kind of a new world that I didn't know anything about. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, who knew that danger tree blaster? I mean, I think if I had the opportunity of calling myself, you would, wouldn't you? But or you'd be, what with the person who dropped the mouse parachutes, the mouse fetus, Tylenol I mean, the job titles are an absolute joy. What as we sort of winding up now because we're coming to the end, but this is something that's only going to we're going to have more and more of these conflict situations as more and more people arrive on the planet. What did you have cause for hope whilst researching and writing this, do you think? Dare I ask that question?
Yeah. I did, partly because I had read so much about the situation in this country anyway, in the 1800s and early 1900s, where the attitude was really, these creatures are either a commodity, we want their fur, we're going to use them for meat or fur, or they're varmints. They're taking our animals, they're taking the deer that we want to hunt. So the attitude was wipe them out. And the government participated. There were bounties on mountain lions and bears and wolves, and there were practices like dropping poison meat. It was just, there was no kind of national conscience about that. And that is starting in the 60s and 70s with the animal rights, animal welfare movement, the conservation movement, that changed. And so we have made progress. It does sometimes seem hopeless. But I think the other thing happening is, again, because of the constant pressure of animal welfare groups, and also just the public doesn't see animals that way anymore. People see an intrinsic value in wild animals. And so that is a good thing. And what's been happening recently, there's been organizations that actively promote coexistence, particularly among humans and wolves, humans and coyotes, humans and mountain lions, because there's been this ongoing conflict between ranchers, farmers, and the people who care about the animals. So there's groups that kind of try to bring both sides together into a room and to sit down and talk. And these are people who don't normally sit down and talk together, and to get them to listen and maybe empathize. So that's a very specific approach. There's people who are trained in facilitating these conferences and these meetings. And the hope is that these groups that have both sides represented, that those people will steer the policy, and that it won't be just sort of randomly made by some lawmakers in a back room, that it will be informed and fair. And so there's a lot of work going on in that area. And there's also the USDA, which runs wildlife services, which are the people that are brought in. If a rancher has some issues with livestock being taken, the wildlife services traditionally has come in and, trapped or killed those animals. And this past year or the year before, they've made a bunch of hires of people at wildlife services who are specifically, they're called non-lethal specialists. So they come in and they not only it's not all ranchers. Sometimes it's people with, just 5 or 6 goats in their backyard or a chicken coop. And they're like, oh, these coyotes are coming in, come and kill the coyote. So the wildlife services people will talk to them about, ways to build a better nighttime enclosure or how to keep the brush cut back. And they'll also, and they'll help with some of these things is the idea, not just to pay lip service to it, but to help people do these things and to help them build a better enclosure and that kind of thing. So that made me hopeful. I mean, there's still a lot of politics in this country that surrounds particularly wolves in the Northwest, the middle north of the country. But there are good things happening. So I did come away a little hopeful. Yes.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. Well, I have to say, everybody should buy it. It's fantastic. It's got, because it's what I love is it's just a mixture of so much. There's fantastic stories. There's real heart and emotion, and there's big issues in there that you pull apart very skillfully, but with lots of humor and a rollicking good ride along the way. So I've absolutely loved it, and I recommend everybody gets it. And I think we should open up to audience questions now. So Hassan, have you got?
I think the first questions were coming in are around the topic of the effects of animal health. For example, the bear breaking in and eating cooking oil and fats and kind of junk food. What impacts is that having? And there's also Nancy pointed out that it's funny to hear and see about animals drinking alcohol and using drugs, like the dolphins using pufferfish to get high.
Really? Yeah, I didn't know.
According to Nancy, is that true?
Yeah. No, I know about that. Yeah, the dolphins use pufferfish to get high, and there's a whole bunch of animals using drugs. Actually, there's like jaguars,
house cats and catnip.
There you go. Exactly.
Yeah.
They definitely they're not immune to. But I think that it is very interesting, this idea of which the question before was about the effects of eating, bears eating all this stuff. I don't know if you came across this, Mary, but here in the UK,
Yes.
there's quite a lot of studies. I can't remember the name of the scientist. She's at Brighton University, and she's done a lot on foxes, and we found that we're getting obese foxes in the UK now because of this. The snacking on the trash it's doing the same thing as it does to humans. Did you find that too?
Not the foxes, but I did come across a study that looked at gulls in Rome in particular. Gulls anywhere in an urban area. There's a subset of gulls that like to eat French fries and all the stuff that the tourists draw, French fries and burgers and crap. And there was a study that seemed to suggest that they were getting heart disease. That there was they were literally getting cardiac disease from the food that they were eating, presumably. Yeah. I
didn't know that. I mean, that's that. I didn't know that about gulls, but yeah, I mean, I saw some terrifying photos of obese foxes. It was horrible, like these foxes the urban foxes that looked like they'd been inflated, and so it's bad for whatever.
Yeah, I can't think of any way in which it's good for animals to become dependent on human food. Doesn't I mean, unless there's nothing in their own natural environment, and it would mean starving otherwise. I mean, we have a situation here in California where, with wildfires, what happens when there's massive wildfires, you see animals coming out, and there are more efforts by these animals to break it, to find anything to eat. So in that case, it's healthier, better to eat crap than to die of starvation. But setting aside that, I can't think of a scenario where it's healthier. Yeah.
Sinead then asked a more specific question to the author, actually, is how do you come up with ideas for your books? Do you decide, I'll write about X? Do you hear a story about caterpillar trials and just go from there?
Oh gosh, I wish it were an easy thing. It is the hardest thing for me to do, to decide on another book topic. Every now and then it's just a snap moment. Like the only time I've actually had a moment where the light bulb went off and it was like, that's my next book, was I was looking, I don't know why, I was leafing through an issue of Film Quarterly, which makes me sound really intellectual. I don't know why I don't read Film Quarterly, but there was a reference to the colposcopic films of Masters and Johnson. And I know, colposcopy, that's a cervical biopsy, right? I was like, it sounds to me like Masters and Johnson were literally filming inside a woman's body. And I thought sex research, the research, like figuring out the physiology of sex for the first, in the beginning, what a delightfully awkward undertaking. And I was like, that's my next book. So that was a moment where I instantly knew this could be a great book topic. But this book was this very roundabout, I won't even bore you with it, but it starts in one spot, often with something that I came across in a past book that I knew I wanted to do something with, but I couldn't fit it into the current project. So I kind of have it in the back of my head. Packing for Mars was a case that was the astronaut and living in space book. That came about partly because I always knew one day I wanted to write about this, what I'd heard. I was reporting a story on osteoporosis, which is a little dreary topic. I thought, how can I liven this up? And I spoke to an astronaut who was an MD, and we were talking about bone loss, which is an issue with astronauts. And we're on the phone, and as happens often with me on the phone, the conversation veered off to other topics. And he told me about this. It's basically a toilet training for astronauts. It's a toilet at NASA that looks like a normal toilet, but there's a video camera in the bowl pointing up and a closed circuit television monitor right there. So you sitting on the toilet see your ass from below. And the idea was to practice, in essence, docking with the toilet, because you're not sitting, you're just kind of hovering, and you had to get the angle right or your crap would gum up the airflow holes, and the hole is small. So they had to practice docking with the toilet. And they did this by sitting on this toilet, and there's the video camera, and I thought, God, what happens to those videotapes, and can I do that and see that? And I thought, but of course I couldn't work it into an osteoporosis story. So in the back of my mind, I was like, one day I will write about that toilet. And so fast forward 15 years, something else got me thinking about astronauts and space. And I thought, oh yeah, that'd be an opportunity to work in the, so sometimes it's that where I'm just, I don't know, that kind of thing. But I wish I had that list of books waiting, ready to go. It's actually a very difficult thing for me to find something that will be of interest to me, be of interest to readers. I don't know. It's not easy. I don't know. Do you find it easy, Lucy?
Yeah.
No. In an answer. I mean, it's interesting. It's because you've got to choose something that you're really interested in, because you're going to be. I mean, I don't know about you, but my last book I just wrote, that took me 2.5 years to research and write.
Same. So 2.5 years. Yeah.
Yeah. You've got to really
choose wisely.
Know about that stuff.
Yeah,
do you know what I
exactly.
mean? Because it's pretty, it's pretty detailed, and you do a lot the same as me, that you're scouring a lot of academic journals, which are very dry reading, and then turning that into something that's a rollickingly good story, and looking for the angles of how to tell the very sciencey thing in something that's going to be of broad interest and humor. I mean, I wonder for you, actually, as someone, I love to use humor, as I always sort of think it's like the sugar coating that covers the bitter pill of information and makes people,
exactly.
But do you, it's because I mean, so much of your writing is so gloriously, just delightfully, not sort of in your face, but there's just an undercurrent of wry delight in so much of it. And I wonder how important it is for you with the stories and the subject to know that there's going to be humor in there.
Oh, it's very important. Yeah, I wouldn't undertake something that doesn't seem to offer any opportunity for that. I mean, sometimes it's not straightforward. I mean, Grunt had to do with military science, and there's a lot of fairly sober stuff in that book, and it wasn't entirely clear where the humor would come from. I did have a sense that some of that was going to come from the fact that I was a complete outsider and ignoramus to all things, not just the science, but the culture of the military, and that I would, be kind of stumbling along in a clueless way, and that some of the humor would be at my expense. So sometimes it's not the material itself, it's kind of the situations. But yeah, the bonk, the sex research, the physiology of sex, I knew that there would be all kinds of humorous material just because of the awkward nature of bringing people into the laboratory setting and have them doing sexual things. It's just kind of awkward, and there's going to be it'll be easy to make that fun. But yes, that is definitely a part of it. Yeah, there's certain things that I just don't think will work for me, that will be fun for me or for the reader.